arguing the initial cause of it, in order to prove that suffering is a result of human action rather than a direct punishment from God. One may ask, will God, with his ultimate grace, ever consider not letting the human race suffer under his will? No. As humans who are curious by nature, we often find ourselves wondering why it is that God allows such suffering when God is in control of all things. I will provide Augustine's theology from the City of God. Which is studied throughout philosophy classes here in FCA, to let us understand that God is a physician, and that suffering is a medicine for salvation, rather than a punishment for damnation. Without the story of Night, Elie Wiesel's personal memoir that is read in 12th grade literature, which dove into his experience as a concentration camp survivor, I would not have dove deeper into the struggle of losing faith, which human beings are faced with when suffering. Suffering, as seen in Night, is bound to happen to human beings, and rather than suffering being directly caused by the abandonment from God, it is rather the result of corruption, which can easily consume mankind due to the fact that nothing is perfect. Before diving further into the misunderstandings of suffering alone, I would like to define suffering and what it means to be led by the corrupted mindset. In the context of Night, which occurred during World War II, one can see a man with corrupted power overruling the innocent, leading to the mass suffering of individuals. Moreover, Hitler used the Nazi Party to strategically deceive against the people of Germany. He was able to take advantage of their miserable state after war and their desperate need to be led by someone. The faithful believers of God became victims of a genocide, which evokes much questioning as to why they were put through such suffering. Will one ever be able to fully understand the motivations behind evil actions? Well, in Hitler's Ethics, the Nazi Pursuit of Evolutionary Progress, by Richard Wickard, he goes into detail behind the ideals that Hitler upheld. That by eliminating the Jews, who are considered evil beings, the world would morally progress. And by applying Nazi policy, a utopia, where the human race would improve under his will, would flourish. With a corrupted morality like that of Hitler's, one is bound to be faced with suffering. In this historical case, it was the Jews who suffered both mentally and physically, proving that others' actions affect those around them more evidently. Now, what is suffering? Suffering, using Noelia Bueno Gomez's definition in conceptualizing suffering and pain, could be defined as an unpleasant or even anguishing experience which severely affects a person at a psychophysical and an existential level. The choices people make through free will depend on surrounding factors such as the state of mind one has, one's attitudes in conflicting circumstances, one's resources, one's personal commitments and attachments to life, which then result in various experiences, including pain and suffering. Could it have been Hitler's entitlement to power that led him to fulfill his longing passion to eliminate an entire religious group? Yes, an individual's doings are significantly influenced by their environment. Suffering is so prevalent in everyday life for every individual. But in the case of Elie Wiesel, rather than suffering being a punishment from his sin, it rather was the result of the actions of one who was corrupted in mind, body, and soul. Continuing on with Night, Wiesel doubted his faith in God due to believing that the extremity of what he suffered was a direct punishment from God. By individuals having to challenge their doubts in order to comprehend that in the end, one truly needs the Creator of life to be their main support, one will then understand that to fear the Lord is to fear the act of straying away from God. Suffering is stated to be bound to happen to all. Divine suffering, it awaits its redemption, linked to that of man, was constantly preached as a warning to act in virtue in Night. Why do we call suffering an ultimate test of faith? It truly comes down to our understanding of how free will is being corrupted. Augustine's overall claim is that evil is a byproduct of God's creativity, rather than created directly by him. He believes humans have been brought up with the dual ability to choose between the good and the evil, and the will to choose comes from both the mind and the heart. When Hitler rose to power, he was able to feed off the country's disparity. in order to fulfill his agenda. But those who followed a moral compass doubted an individual's capability to pursue great evils, doubted his resolve to exterminate us, annihilate an entire people, wipe out an entire population dispersed throughout so many nations. We can easily change the path of our desires and our choices between the good and the bad based on desires, because it is really our delights that drive us, our choices simply following as a ratification of our deepest desires. The reasoning behind why things are so easily corrupted by humans themselves and not by God is that the things which he made are indeed good because from him, yet mutable because made not out of him, but out of things. God is not to blame for evil. For although humans are created under his perfect image, people still do not have the essence of being a piece of God, who is perfect. The two cities Augustine claims exist here on earth are the good and the wicked. The contrary actions between the good and the bad have arisen not from a difference in their nature or origin, since God, the good author and creator of all essence, created them both, but rather from a difference in their wills and desires. Unbelievers of God stray away from morality due to the idea that they could be their own good, lapse to this private good of their own from that higher and beatific good of that which is common to all. To prevent that separation from God himself, one has to understand God's place in suffering and doubt, because it is our misunderstandings that leave us with the tendency to doubt one's faith. God, who is in control over what he has created under his image, is viewed to have superiority over humans because there's a lack of understanding from the human race related back to the motivations, back to his actions. As one sees in night, the prisoners of the concentration camps endured the great evils as a result of other human beings, which made them question God's ability to protect them. We don't understand his replies. They dwell in the depths of our souls and remain there until we die. Those who are faithful, like Weasel, who base their actions around what is right according to the teachings of their faith, do not expect great punishment from the Lord. After he saw the great flames of the corrupted hearts, he expressed concern about feeling anger within himself and questioned, why should I sanctify his name? The terrible, eternal master of the universe chose to be silent. What was there to thank him for? To be able to grasp Weasel's experience easily, one can philosophically understand the natural consequences that occur because of an undetermined situation that humans are predestined to. To put into better perspective, one can compare Ellie Weasel to a child who grew up with poor parenting. As a result, the lack of attention from the parent will leave the child, who is innocent in the situation, not knowing what is good, true, and beautiful. The child is not to blame, like Weasel, who was faithful and virtuous. Therefore, it is not under his control to prevent himself from doing what is wrong, because all he has known is wrong decision and poor decision making. It is easy to feel abandoned or betrayed by our Creator, as Weasel did in his time in Auschwitz, but evil is not done in the hands of the God, but rather is a natural consequence of the corruptness of human actions. Ellie Weasel, after seeing the horrors of his people being thrown into gas chambers, emphasized that never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Jewish people during this war were incapable of practicing the human sense of compassion. They no longer clung to hope. They no longer could think, no instincts, because their souls had been deprived and consumed by a black flame. In seeking closure, one should understand that human beings are capable of overcoming evil by consenting to what attracts us, both based on our affections and our reasons. Passions of an individual will always be the greatest drive for people. Without the desire to want to preserve hope, one will not be able to be fulfilled with the Lord's mercy. If we think to ourselves and ask, is it fair for God to allow suffering unto good people? Many will argue that God should prevent it in all cases. At one hand, we have atheists who claim that there's something morally problematic about a morally perfect God allowing the suffering and pain we see today. There must not be a morally perfect God after all. Arguably, when considering God as being omnipotent and omniscient, it logically falls inconsistently with the existence of evil in the world created under his image. When we consider one as being all-powerful, we imagine evil to be inferior to them. Who wins the battle in the end? Does evil overpowering God lead to the overcorruption of the human race? God holds this authority, which ideally works to prevent all suffering, especially that upon his faithful followers. But why do we doubt God's power? If we are willing to understand more, we would be able to see that in the battle between God and evil, God is not the one being overtaken. Rather, instead, the ultimate cause of suffering is that of evil taking over our own morality, which empowers corruption over individuals. So, what about fate? Are we deprived of free will if we have a destined fate? Often people conclude that by having a destined fate that only God knows the end of, one's actions are ultimately being controlled and moved directly by God. One's fate, however, although known by God, has no source of protection from human fault to prevent evil from occurring. What leads us to sin then? It is those desires from a sinful nature that stray away people from good nature. When one takes God's actions towards evil, they can conclude that when he does not respond in a way that benefits the individual, he is rather being ignorant to suffering than acting on goodness. Now let us consider the following. If moral good exists, how can moral evil exist in the same world? With every coexisting thing like good and bad, one ultimately has to be superior. So what is God upholding? If there were to be supreme goodness, then goodness would be able to rule out the possibility of evil. However, evil has been permitted in this world so one can be able to understand God's ultimate righteousness and love. At night, Weasel and others imprisoned under Nazi authority pleaded to the Lord, "O God, Master of the universe, with your infinite compassion, have mercy on us." What does it take to successfully attain the forgiveness of God? Well, one has to become aware of the corruptness mindset. Like goodness, forgiveness should be sought for even if evil is present. It will further enlighten the compassion God holds. At night, those who were losing faith in God due to falling in a trap of evil claim that God is testing us. Temptations do not come from God himself, but rather from the fallen angel, the devil. While sinful nature is damaging to the good God has instilled, the doctrine of redemption offers individuals a saving from sin. The doctrine of redemption refers to the mystery of God's deliverance of mankind from the evil of sin and his restoration of man to the state of grace by the act of a divine power and merciful love. The presence of evil itself does not counteract with the promise God has made for his people, which is salvation under his will. In conclusion, although many falsely believe the cause of their agony is due to the act of abandonment by God, the truth is that through suffering, one is being called to correctly utilize their free will to pursue moral excellence. As we see in Elie Wiesel's Night, the Almighty utilizes suffering as the ultimate test of faith. And although many believe that suffering is a result of God's abandonment, it is evident that it is his greatest act of love. To seek both peace and understanding in the great mysteries of God the Almighty, one has to willingly be able to recognize the fault in the corrupted mindset that the human race is inevitable to attain. Thank you.
I thought it was a very well argued point. What thoughts I have, though, and I'd like to expand on 2 points. The first being, you laid out a very good argument, but what about from a child's position, right, who doesn't necessarily know morality yet? They haven't developed, how do you respond to that, right, from a child's point of view?
Well, I think
Suffering.
Okay,
Yeah.
So when I compared Elie Wiesel to the child who was raised with poor parenting, you cannot blame it on them because they don't know any better. And so in his case, in the case of the child who's not raised with knowing what is good and what is bad, all his actions are based on what is taught at home. And so if he chooses to be bad at school, you can't really blame him because there's nothing more for him to look after. And so with Elie Wiesel's case, he did know what was good. He had his faith, he was faithful, he was virtuous, he devoted his life to his faith. And so he understood that what was happening to him was not any good and there was evil occurring. He was just confused on why it was occurring, why it was happening to him. And so with the kid, they don't know any better. And so for them, it seems natural to them that they suffer because they don't know the good.
I guess I'll go next. So, what was your justification for using night, and a bit of an extreme example, versus a more mundane, everyday suffering?
Well, with night, obviously it is very extreme, but it's also very important to bring in those extreme examples because it brings awareness on things that we don't want to happen again. We don't want people to go through that suffering ever again. And the reason I brought in the comparison of the child as well is because in our everyday lives, we might not ever suffer pain like that to that extreme, but we do still suffer every day. There is pain that we face, and so I wanted to bring both extremes, but more every day.
Okay. One more question. So your argument also plays a lot on perspective, which can easily be looked at as the glass half full or glass empty. So how does someone's perspective play a role in your argument?
Well, with perspective, I mean, obviously everyone has a unique perspective to everything. If you look at it as, I don't deserve this, what is wrong, and then it leads to losing faith, then it's very easy to suffer greater. But if you have a different perspective of what can I do to change my circumstance, what can I do to better my faith and have greater trust in the Lord in this case, then that could also change the way you go through suffering.
In your defense and in your paper, you mentioned how people oftentimes blame other people for their misfortune or for their suffering. Do we as a moral society have a call to action, so to speak, to call out or educate those who blame other people for their suffering and direct them towards the truth? Or rather do we stand back and allow that cycle of self-unawareness to continue? And how do we do that?
I believe we do have a call for action, that we do need to make people aware of their own faults. But in the end, like with my argument, it all goes back to being self-aware. It all goes back to understanding your own fault. And if you can't force that on anyone, and so if the person isn't willing to fully understand, that's not on anyone else. But I do think we do have a call for action, that we need to go out and allow people to, I guess, tell people to be more self-aware and pursue that. Yes, Paola.
Do you think that suffering is a kind of hammer and anvil to test and to try the faith of people in God? What happens in someone's life if there is an absence almost of suffering? Say you're rich, or your family is rich, all your cares all your needs are taken care of. What happens to that person if there isn't so much suffering as, say, something like Elie Wiesel?
Well, I think suffering is unavoidable. I think at the end you are bound to suffer in some way. And maybe not as physical as Elie Wiesel did, but there's always that mental suffering that you have with doubts, with regrets, and all these mental things that could lead to suffering. And I mean, in Hitler's case, he was one who didn't really suffer physically because he wasn't in the concentration camps, but in the end, his actions that were corrupted did lead to him killing himself. So he had all this power, he had all the support, he was in the top, yet he still suffered. And so, yeah.
You said that the evils of life aren't your faults, pretty right? So are you making an argument that suffering, or human suffering is because of other people?
Yes. I think going back like with fate, for example, so God has created all of us under his image, and we do have a destined fate, but in the end we also have free will, and that gives us the ability to choose between the good and the bad. And so God created us, but we're not God. We're not perfect. We still have flaws, and so that's why with that, evil is a byproduct of what he has created.
So would you go as far as to say if suffering is the result of evil, that suffering in itself is evil?
I think suffering can be seen as evil, but in the end, if you persevere it could be considered a good thing because you could grow out of it. Like you could benefit out of suffering. And like Williams' thesis, how good can come from suffering. Sorry.
I think to expand on Ms. Sue's points as well, so, and you touched on it in your thesis as far as atheism, right? Or that's, whatever, in the absence of God. In your opinion, or based on your research, do you think that an individual that's either agnostic or atheist, do they suffer more if suffering is equal, anybody that's, say, in an internment camp? Do you think it's more or less, right? Or, how do you reconcile that?
I don't think I could go to the extent of claim that they would suffer more than someone who is faithful, but I think because they don't have anyone to like look up on, to fall behind, like I trust in God, and like there's no promise that they're looking after, like mercy, like in the end those who believe in God believe that they're gonna be saved, and so I wouldn't claim that they suffer more. I don't think so.
So kind of related, I believe y'all have briefly studied sort of Kierkegaard a little bit in some of your classes, but maybe not. He makes an argument that, in talking about the Bible, he makes an argument that the very book, the Bible, that gives comfort to faithful believers in their suffering is the very book that also calls them to suffer more than others. So how does that sort of fit into your argument, or what are your thoughts about, that, there is maybe, like you're talking about, some more comfort for a Christian than an atheist, but then that book then calls them to suffer more and be persecuted and different things like that.
I think that relates back to my topic because with Elie Wiesel and those who endured that suffering through concentration camps, they had the idea that because they were faithful and because they devoted themselves to the Lord, they would never encounter that. And so I think that's where sometimes we become so comfortable with the Lord that whenever we experience difficulties, we feel as if we don't deserve it because we've been so good. And so you become unaware of the bad possibilities